What's going on, guys? Dare here with Fantasy Football Advice, coming at you with another fantasy football video. Today, it's Friday, so you know what time it is. We are going over the entire wide receiver landscape heading into week 7. What that means is we will be going matchup by matchup, letting you know a bit about each player's floor, their ceiling, and about where we have them ranked. If you're unsure exactly who to start between two players that are valued very similarly this week, the best thing to do is to go to our website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com, check out our rankings. Whichever player we have ranked higher, that's likely the player we would suggest you start. Members of our website also gain access to waiver wire ads with fab suggestions, the priority we would spend on each player, access to the trade model, sports betting picks, DFS picks, and more. So if that interests you, once again, go to our website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com, link as always in the description box below. With that out of the way though, let's hop right into the stat of the day. Yesterday's stat of the day was among the top 19 running backs in fantasy football, only one rusher has fewer than 3 touchdowns. The correct answer was actually Clyde Edwards-Helaire. Congratulations to Hoddard, you got this one right. As for today's stat of the day, which wide receiver with at least 30 targets boasts the highest average separation? Leave your answer in the comment section down below. We'll be happy to let you know who wins in tomorrow's video. With all of that out of the way, let's hop right into the first matchup. The first game we have is Pittsburgh on the road against Tennessee. We'll start on the Pittsburgh side of things, and there are a lot of wide receivers that we're going to be contemplating putting in. We have Juju, Deontay, Chase Claypool, of course, and for those of you in deeper leagues, James Washington. Out of those three, the only one we wouldn't recommend starting is, of course, James Washington. He does appear to be the odd man out when the other 3 wide receivers are healthy. Deontay, of course, the one battling health issues. He is slated to return this week. Does that mean that he will play the entire game without being knocked out by injury? We don't know that for sure, but regardless, we have him ranked as a flex. Juju as well, who's been pretty down. We're at that point where we have to drop him in the rankings as well. So if you're a Juju owner, unfortunately, temper your expectations. We do have him ranked as a flex as well. That's not to say that either of these 2 receivers can't surprise us. Don't forget that the Tennessee Titans give up the 3rd most fantasy points to the position, but if there is one receiver we're trying to fit in our lineup the most, that's definitely Chase Claypool. We have him ranked the highest as a back end 2, high end 3, and to be fair, any one of these single receivers, they would be ranked much higher if there just were not so much competition for targets. On the other side of the ball for Tennessee, there really isn't as much competition for targets. A.J. Brown, the presumed target leader, he missed Thursday's practice with a knee issue. Not great news because we know he did deal with that bone bruise in his knee as well. If he plays though, you should expect good results. This very well could just be a rest day, preparing him to be more healthy on the matchup. We have him ranked as a high-end wide receiver too. And despite Pittsburgh being an all-around solid defense, they've really been giving it up to the wide receiver position. This is a very good spot for A.J. Brown, but outside of him, even with Corey Davis returning, we really wouldn't trust anybody else. Moving into the next matchup, we have the Green Bay Packers. They're on the road against the Houston Texans. This game actually has the highest projected total of the week. For Green Bay though, it's super simple. Davante Adams, start him, nobody else. For Adams though, this is a really good spot for a get-right game. Yes, he disappointed last week, but the Houston Texans, they've given up 5 receiving touchdowns to wide receivers over the last 2 contests, and they really haven't faced a receiver as talented as Adams probably since week 1. He's ranked as the number 2 overall receiver this week. On the other side of the ball though, I understand that the projected total, it's really high. So owners of Brandon Cooks and Will Fuller are probably really excited to get those players in this week. Just remember, the Green Bay Packers are really solid against receivers. They haven't allowed a multi-TD game to the wide receiver position since week 2. So yes, game script, it will be in their favor, but we didn't use that as an excuse to boost them in the rankings. Brandon Cooks, he did still crack the top 30. Will Fuller himself, he's a high end too. Each of them, they do have upside, just don't be disappointed if they dud. Moving into the next matchup, we have Detroit versus Atlanta. This game also comes with a really high total. It's the third highest total on the week at 55 points. I wouldn't be surprised at all if this game shoots out. Unfortunately, on the Detroit side though, it's really tough to trust anyone outside of Kenny Golladay. Hawkinson, of course, you can trust him, but we're talking wide receivers here. It's not as if we're going to trust Marvin Jones or maybe even Danny Amendola. With the buys, of course, you may be desperate, but me personally, I'd rather take a safer option. As for Golladay though, we have him ranked inside the top 10. Both Julio Jones and Calvin Ridley also in the top 10, giving the edge to Julio this week, but both players we have ranked very closely. The next matchup we have is Dallas versus Washington. On the Dallas side, this game, it does come with a bit of risk. With Andy Dalton starting, even if these players are getting a significant amount of targets, we can't really expect the same production we were getting from Dak. So when you factor in the reduction in quality, coupled with the fact that Washington is the absolute best defense so far this season at defending opposing fantasy receivers, this week we really have a lot of risk. It is worth noting though that both Amari Cooper as well as CeeDee Lamb, they both got double-digit targets, but they were playing from behind virtually the entire game. We can't guarantee that amount of targets goes to them this week. So Cooper, he's a mid-grade wide receiver 2. We have Lamb as a high-end wide receiver 3. And Michael Gallup, we would prefer to leave him on the bench. On the other side of the ball, the only real player we're starting is Terry McLaurin. He has a phenomenal matchup this week. We have him ranked as a back-end wide receiver 1, so his floor and his ceiling, they're both going to be high in this matchup. The next game we have is the Buffalo Bills versus the New York Jets. Despite the Bills being on the road, they're still a massive 12-point favorites, which does open up a pretty positive game script for Jamison Crowder. In week 1 against Buffalo, he had 13 targets, translated that into 7 receptions for 115 yards, even catching a touchdown. But his success against Buffalo, it even dates back to last season. In 2019, in both contests, he had a combined 27 targets, converting those targets into 22 receptions, 165 yards, and yes, another receiving touchdown. I think he will be a safe floor option this week. The total upside though, that's definitely in question, but if you're in PPR or potentially half PPR, you could start him safely as a back end 2, high end 3. For Buffalo though, the only real receiver we're trusting is of course Stephon Diggs. He's proved to be virtually matchup proof, so even in a game in which they're nearly 2 touchdown favorites, he should still produce starter level fantasy points, and we have him ranked as a back-end wide receiver 1. With the matchup though heavily favoring the run game over the pass game, we really can't suggest starting any other Buffalo receiver. So we'll move into the next one, Cleveland at Cincinnati. The Bengals will come into this game as home underdogs in a game that's projected to score 50 points. This will be the second time this year these teams have actually faced one another. In that game though, AJ Green got a whopping 13 targets. Clearly, AJ Green not as much a part of this offense as he was back then. Many of those targets, they're going to go to Higgins, they're going to go to Boyd. I definitely see Boyd this week as a safe floor option. His 8 targets in week 2 in their first matchup, he caught 7 of them. He even scored a touchdown, so those 8 targets I could certainly see going up. So Boyd, he's a high floor option this week. We have him ranked as a high end 3. As for Higgins, his role in the range of outcomes, it will be a bit wider. But if you are shooting for maximum upside, Higgins, he can certainly be your guy. We have him ranked right around that wide receiver 30 area. Definitely a high-end flex, somebody you could trust if you did have to start him as your wide receiver 2, which just leaves AJ Green, who ranks just outside the top 40, which means he could be trusted as a flex, but we all know exactly how low his floor can be. On the other side of the ball for Cleveland, Cincinnati's defense, it's pretty underrated at defending opposing receivers. So Odell Beckham, while this will be one of his better matchups as of late, we still have him ranked as a back-end wide receiver 2. Jarvis Landry though, he's more of a high floor flex play, and no other receiver outside of those two we're trusting at all this week. Moving on, we have Carolina versus New Orleans. Big news in this one, of course, Michael Thomas slated to return. It appears that the New Orleans Saints, they really took their time in getting him back on the field, make sure he's healthy. So if they're playing him this week, we expect him to be a full go. For that means we have him ranked inside the top 5, an area that, while healthy, he'll probably maintain for the rest of the season. So for you owners of Michael Thomas out there, be excited to get him in as your one. If our take is, of course, that Michael Thomas will return and be the target monster he once was, that will of course be at the detriment of Emmanuel Sanders, Tre'Quan Smith. Neither of those players we have ranked as flex plays. As for Carolina, we have Robbie Anderson, DJ Moore. The game script for them should be pretty positive. This has a total of 51 points. They're more than a touchdown underdogs on the road. Just keep in mind, the New Orleans Saints have actually not allowed 10 plus receptions to wide receivers in any given matchup since week 1. Yes, Justin Herbert did torch them for 3 receiving touchdowns to wide receivers, but outside of that game, no other team has had a multi-TD performance from the wide receiver position all season. So Robbie Anderson, DJ Moore, they're ranked as back-end wide receiver 2s this week. The edge, it will go to Robbie Anderson, but both players we value very similarly. Moving on, we have the Arizona Cardinals versus the Seattle Seahawks. The Seattle Seahawks give up the most fantasy points to the wide receiver position, so DeAndre Hopkins, it should come as no surprise we have him ranked as the number 1 overall fantasy receiver this week. Christian Kirk, he's also a player that I would like to get in the flex. In these games against Seattle, almost every team is putting together big plays. Christian Kirk, he's already proved to be a threat to score from any part of the field. So despite him only eclipsing 5 targets in one game this season, he's still a solid option to put in the flex this week. As for Seattle, we have DK Metcalf, a bona fide wide receiver 1. Even though the Arizona Cardinals, they're a pretty solid defense against receivers, we have yet to find a defense that could completely shut out DK Metcalf. So Metcalf, he's a wide receiver 1, a mid to high end wide receiver 1, which leaves Tyler Lockett, who has been coming off a couple bad weeks. Last week against Minnesota, he only received 5 targets. The week before that against Miami, he saw just 4. So at this point, we do have to drop him in the rankings a bit. He'll still be inside the top 20, but his floor, it's going to be a bit low. His ceiling always high, of course, but at this point, we always should be prepared for a disappointing performance. Up next, Kansas City Chiefs versus the Denver Broncos. It's almost shocking to see a Kansas City game that has a projected total of just 46 points, but the Broncos, they find a way to slow the game down. That's definitely what we should expect this week. So the opportunities, they may be a bit more few and far between for Kansas City than we typically would expect in other matchups. In those games with Kansas City where the projected totals 55 plus points, we're usually excited to get in Mecole Hardman or maybe Robinson, players that we typically wouldn't start but definitely have the upside to score. Well, in this game, all receivers outside of Tyreek Hill should definitely sit on the bench. Hill himself, he's still a wide receiver 1, but his ceiling in this one, it won't be necessarily as high. His floor, that's also going to be lower, but regardless, he's an auto start each and every week, and of course he's the type of player to turn 5 targets into 2 touchdowns. As for Denver, we have Jerry Jeudy and Tim Patrick, both players that are definitely in flex consideration. Just keep in mind the Kansas City Chiefs, they've been very stingy all year at allowing fantasy points to wide receivers. They have given up 2 touchdowns to the position in back-to-back weeks, but Denver, they're not a strong passing offense, so that's a trend I could definitely see coming to an end this week. Moving on, we have the San Francisco 49ers. They're on the road against the New England Patriots. The Patriots will come into this game as 2-point home favorites. It's a game with an extremely low total of just 43.5 points. In a game where the total is so low, we definitely should temper our expectations for all offensive players. So on the San Francisco side, the only 2 typically in consideration, Brandon Ayuk, Deebo Samuel. Ayuk, this will knock him down, knock him out of flex territory. And Deebo Samuel, while he has been trusted while healthy as of late, in this one, we really can't trust him as anything more than a flex. Julian Edelman on the other side, he's probably the only other receiver we could consider starting. His floor should be relatively high, but it's not as if we think he has a very high ceiling as well. So for us in the flex, we typically shoot for upside. I could see people leaving him on the bench in favor of other options. Just know we do have him ranked in that flex conversation. Moving on, we have the Jacksonville Jaguars on the road against the LA Chargers. The Jacksonville Jaguars will come in as over a touchdown underdog, which promotes a very pass-friendly game script for their offense. There are 3 receivers on that team we could consider starting in our lineups. DJ Chark, of course, the highest ranked receiver. We have him as a back-end wide receiver too. If he comes into this matchup more healthy, those targets that could bring in massive upside, but we still shouldn't be sleeping on Laviska Shenault. Shenault we have ranked just outside the top 30. If DJ Chark ends up getting hit, taken out of the game, the upside for Shenault, it would be massive. He doesn't need that, of course, to have a good performance. We definitely see him as a very solid flex play. And Keelan Cole, he's also a name you could throw in the hat as well. Understandably, a lot of people have receivers on bye, a lot of injuries. So Keelan Cole, while we do have him ranked outside the top 40, in a desperate situation, he could definitely be a player you consider. As for the Chargers, we have Keenan Allen. He's a wide receiver one this week. The Jacksonville Jaguars, while they do rank around middle of the pack at allowing fantasy points to receivers, they've been allowing a ton of receptions. Keenan Allen, his specialty is racking up those receptions on short to intermediate routes. So a high volume game from Allen, that's definitely what we could expect. As for Mike Williams, he really popped off last week. We have him ranked inside the top 30. And no, we don't need an injury to Keenan Allen in order for him to produce. Up next, we have the Tampa Bay Buccaneers versus the Las Vegas Raiders. This one's pretty simple. On the Las Vegas side, we're really not trusting any Raiders receiver. You could throw in Henry Ruggs and just hope for the best, but it's probably going to be a losing endeavor. So for us, preferably, we would like to leave him on the bench. On the Tampa Bay side, we have Chris Godwin, Mike Evans, of course. Evans, due to injury, he is going to be ranked a bit lower this week. We have him ranked as a mid to high-end wide receiver too. Chris Godwin, he will get the edge this week. We have him as a back-end wide receiver 1. Neither player, though, we do see as having a super high ceiling just due to the fact that the Raiders, they really give it up on the ground. We could see Tampa Bay getting a lead, relying on their ground game, something similar to what we saw last week. Moving into the final matchup of the week, we have the Chicago Bears on the road against the LA Rams. This game, yet again, it has a pretty low total. We're looking at 45 total points. Rams, 5.5 point favorites. So yes, the Chicago Bears, they do have a pretty solid passing game script. But we find ourselves in yet another situation where, despite having a solid passing game script, the matchup, it's just really tough to overlook. The Rams have allowed the second fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers, so Allen Robinson, while he is a bona fide wide receiver 1 on the season, this week, we do have him as a high end 2. No other receiver for Chicago should we be considering starting. And for the Rams, we also have to knock down Kupp and Woods as well. Chicago, they've also been very limiting to opposing wide receivers, and with the Rams actually coming in as the home favorites, the volume, it honestly couldn't be there. And when we're talking about 2 receivers who've been struggling with volume all season, their floors, their ceilings, they're going to be a bit lower this week. We have both players ranked as back-end wide receiver 2s. In order to reach that ceiling, they'll need to score, which is definitely possible. Just temper your expectations this week. But guys, that's gonna do it for this video. We really hope you enjoyed. If you did, how about hitting that like button? If you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button. We thank you all for watching, and we'll catch you on the next one.